Hello, everyone. Welcome to the May edition of Stay at Home Lecture. I am Tim Nutt, the director of the UAMS Historical Research Center, the Archives Division of the Medical School in Little Rock, and glad to have you here today. And as I mentioned, this is the Stay at Home Lecture series. It's sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions, which is the Friends organization for the Historical Research Center. And they help the Historical Research Center in a number of ways. In addition to sponsoring programming such as this and uh, programs throughout the year, they also help the Historical Research Center purchase materials for the collection, including books for our History of Medicine collection and some of our archival collections that we need help in purchasing. As I mentioned, the Historical Research Center is the archives division of UAMS, and so we are like a traditional archives in that we have archival materials such as correspondence, photographs, ledgers, newspaper clippings, things like that. But then we also function sort of as a museum because we have a lot of artifacts in our collection. And our mission at the Historical Research Center is to preserve not only the institutional record of UAMS, but also the history of medicine and the health sciences throughout Arkansas. So I'd encourage you, if you'd like, to have a tour of our facility. We're located in the Education 2 building on the UAMS campus, and we're on the 5th floor. So if you'd like to come and visit us, we'd love to have you here. The contact information is up on your screen right now. And speaking of contact information, going back to the society for a minute, the society is as I mentioned, an organization that helps support the UAMS Historical Research Center. And we'd love to have you as a member. The dues are inexpensive, $5 for students, and you can be a student anywhere. You do not have to be a medical school student. You can be in high school, other universities and colleges throughout the United States and even worldwide, if there are any out there. Individual memberships are $15. We also have family membership, $25, and then it progressively goes up from there. You could, if you're interested in joining, you can visit the link that is shown on the screen, or you can just go to the library website and then navigate over to the Historical Research Center, and you'll find information there about it and a membership form to fill out. You can bypass all of that if you'd like and just go directly to paypal.me/shmhp and pay your dues directly online, or you can also Venmo the society your dues as well at SHMHP on Venmo. So I hope you'll consider joining the society and helping support the Historical Research Center. Now, the stay-at-home lecture series, as I mentioned, is sponsored by the Society. It's held the first Thursday of every month from noon until 1. And all of the recordings or all of the presentations are recorded and then later uploaded to YouTube. So if you missed one and you want to go watch it, you can just go to YouTube, look for the SHMHP or Society of History of Medicine, and you'll find all of our videos up there. And this one will go up probably within the next 2 weeks. Now, next month on June 5th, I'll be the speaker again, and I'm going to be continuing our series on the founders of UAMS, and we'll talk about Dr. Claiborne Watkins and find out a little bit more information about him. Today, though, we're talking about Dr. Edwin Bentley, one of the other founders, one of the 8 founders of UAMS, and we'll hear a little bit about that later in the presentation. But Dr. Bentley was instrumental in not only the founding of the university, but also just medical history in general, not just in Arkansas, but around the country where he was stationed when he was in the Army. So let's learn a little bit more about Dr. Edwin Bentley. He was born in Norwich, Connecticut, which is in New London County. in the Northeast. The town of Norwich was founded in 1659 um, by settlers, by settlers led by Major John Mason, John James Fitch, and Lieutenant Francis Griswold. Those three purchased the land known as 9 miles square that became the city of Norwich from the Mohegan Indians, um, and um, and so that town grew up, and that is where Dr. Edwin Bentley was born in 1824. His parents were George W. Bentley and Anna Williams, his mother. Edwin was the fifth of 7 children born to George and Anna Bentley. And you can see they were married in the early 1800s, I think around 1807, 1808, somewhere around in there. Their first child was born in 1810, and their last was born in 1830. And so Edwin Bentley was one of the 3 youngest children of the Bentley family. Now, as I mentioned, they did live in Norwich, and Norwich was one of the largest cities in the Northeast, especially during the colonial period. It was a center of wealth, a lot of commerce there, and it was important. It was an important city, and it produced a lot of historic figures that played direct roles in the Revolutionary War. So this is the type of town that the Bentley children grew up in. And so some of the figures that I mentioned that played roles in the Revolutionary War, you had Samuel Huntington, who is a signer of the Declaration of Independence and president of the U.S. under the Articles of Confederation. Uh, uh, he was also governor of Connecticut. And then another famous individual you might have heard of is Benedict Arnold, who was one of George Washington's trusted generals in the Continental Army. And of course, he was a spy for the British Army. And so interesting history at Norwich. And like I said, this is the atmosphere that the Bentley children grew up in. Edward would have been, born in 1824. Norwich was still a prominent town in Connecticut. As Bentley got older, he wanted to go to school. And of course, in the East, there were a lot of formal medical institutions that one could attend if you wanted to become a medical doctor. Of course, you had Harvard Medical School, you had Columbia. And so Bentley, after he was of age, he went to a number of colleges in the Northeast to receive training, including the New York City Medical College, the 23rd Street Medical College, the Bellevue Hospital Medical College, which you see here is on your screen. He did a little training there. You might be familiar with Bellevue as being the oldest public hospital in the U.S. Goes back all the way back to 1736, where it started out, when it started out. And in 1798, the city purchased a farm, built up the hospital again, and they used it to quarantine the sick during a series of yellow fever outbreaks, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And the hospital was formally named Bellevue Hospital in 1824, same year as when Edwin Bentley was born. Later, Bellevue became notable because became known as an insane asylum. That would the city would send people with mental illnesses to Bellevue, and it actually became sort of not a nickname, but when you say someone's going mad or something, they're going to ship you off to Bellevue. So that's where that saying came from Bellevue Hospital in New York. Now, Bentley, eventually he ended up at the University of the City of New York, also known as New York University, and that's where he graduated in 1850. New York University was also an old institution. It was chartered in 1831 by the New York State Legislature and founded in 1832. The medical department, though, was fairly new when Bentley graduated from there. It had only been founded in 1841, so only open 8 years when, or excuse me, 9 years when Bentley graduated in 1850. Excuse me, 1849. I was correct the first time. So after he graduates, Bentley goes back to Norwich, Connecticut, and establishes a pretty successful private practice. Also at this time, Bentley marries his first wife, Elizabeth Tortolot. I think I'm pronouncing that right. In late December or in December 1849. And they would go on and they would have 2 daughters, Edwina and Lottie. Edwina died pretty young at the age of 29. Lottie lived until 1913. But by all accounts, the family, they were in Norwich, a prosperous town. He had a successful medical practice going on. And they stayed that way for pretty good ways. You can see the 1850 census. This was before his daughters were born. He's listed as a physician, of course, at the age of 23, Elizabeth at age 24. And then they continued that way. They had daughters, 1860. Of course, the daughters are showing up on the 1860 census. And his practice just continued to blossom and be very successful. And it stayed like that until the beginning of the Civil War, where he gave up his practice and enlisted in the Union Army. So at the beginning of the Civil War, Dr. Bentley, as I mentioned, enlisted in Connecticut and was placed at the rank of assistant surgeon in the 1st Regiment of the Connecticut Heavy Artillery. Later that year, he was assigned to the medical staff, and later on, when he helped found the medical school here in Little Rock, he was the only one of the 8 founders to have served in the Union Army. The rest of the ones who did serve in the military were served in the Confederate Army. From there on, in service in the Union Army, you can see some of his when he was mustered in, when he was mustered out. He finally mustered out, reaching the rank of lieutenant colonel. And he retired from the service in July in 1888. But he served in different locations throughout the Civil War and even after the Civil War. Most of his career actually was with that Connecticut infantry. It was attached to the Department of Pennsylvania, and they're best known that regiment, excuse me, best known, and he is best known. Dr. Bentley is best known for his service as brigade surgeon during the siege of Yorktown, Virginia, in May of 1862. During that siege, 182 Union soldiers were killed and 300 Confederate soldiers were killed. Now, in September of 1862, Dr. Bentley was placed in charge of the 3rd Division U.S. Army General Hospital in Alexandria, Virginia. And then later that year, he was placed in charge of the hospitals all over the area, in the area of Alexandria, excuse me. And that would include the Mansion House Hotel or Hospital, uh, which was attached as the hotel that the owner of the house, James Green, operated. His house was connected to the hotel and directly behind this building. But this building served as the largest hospital, the largest Union hospital in the Alexandria area. Another hospital that Bentley oversaw was the Louverture Hospital, which served it served the African Americans and Native American soldiers. It was built in 1863 and it opened in February of 1864. It was named for the Haitian Revolutionary leader Toussaint Louverture. I don't think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it was a pretty extensive hospital compound. The building included barracks, cookhouses, mess halls, officers' quarters, a dead house, and a dispensary. Long canvas tents allowed for ventilation and separation of patients, excuse me. So Dr. Bentley is already building his career during the Civil War. He's been promoted. He is in charge of the hospital, all of the hospitals in the Alexandria area. And so he stays like that until the end of the Civil War. After the Civil War, he stays in Washington, where he sort of still oversees those hospitals after the war. And during this time, he meets Marguerite Williams, and they get married in the late 1860s. And then later in 1871, the couple had a son, Carl Edwin Bentley, who would later become a prominent physician in Little Rock, just like his father. Mrs. Bentley died in 1920 in Little Rock. Now, while in Washington, Bentley was named the first professor of anatomy at Howard University, a Black university that was founded for the recently freed African Americans. So I think this is indicative of how Bentley, how generous and how socially conscious Bentley was throughout his life, teaching at Howard University for the recently freed African Americans and other African Americans who wanted to go to school. So he stays in Washington for a while. He is then he was stationed in Washington after the war, as I mentioned, at the Russell Barracks and the Lincoln Barracks. And then he was transferred to California, where he served at Camp Reynolds and Point San Jose for a few years. While he was also in California, he was named superintendent of the California Insane Asylum. And he was professor of descriptive and macroscopic anatomy and pathology at the University of the Pacific Medical School when it reopened in 1870. He was also the Assistant Surgeon General at the Presidio of San Francisco from about 1872 until early 1873. So he wasn't at the Presidio for very long. While he was at the Presidio in 1872, he accompanied the military into the Black Hills of Northern California and Southern Oregon, not the Black Hills we're talking about in South Dakota. But this was during the Modoc War, and took charge of the field hospital there while the U.S. military was in this conflict with the Modoc people. And again, that event was triggered by the forced relocation of the Modocs to a reservation. And so Bentley went up with the military to Northern California to serve as to serve in the field hospital in charge of it. So after that, Bentley was transferred to the Little Rock Arsenal in 1878, and this is where he obviously makes a big impact on the medical history of Arkansas. He arrived in 1878. His family and he himself quickly immersed themselves in the military, social, and medical circles of Little Rock. Bentley joined the local medical societies, and his wife was appointed a commissioner of the Little Rock Columbian Art Memorial. Now, at that time in Little Rock, there were two different organizations which claimed to be the official state medical association. You had the State Medical Association of Arkansas, and then you had the Arkansas Medical Society. And so these were the two different groups that were they were pretty divisive, and that had begun in the early 1870s when there was a disagreement with the Pulaski County Medical Society, and so they broke off, and so you had these two different factions from that, creating two different state medical societies. Ultimately, the Arkansas Medical Society became the official one, and that was the one recognized by the American Medical Association. And Bentley was instrumental in sort of bridging that divide that was between the two medical societies, and he helped the two groups come together and to come together as one, mainly because they wanted to focus on building a medical school, the prominent physicians in Little Rock, and that they did not want to have this divisiveness that was in Little Rock at the time. They didn't feel it was productive enough, and it would be an obstacle to creating a medical school. Now, at the time when Dr. Bentley arrived, there was no other university in Little Rock. There were, except for St. John's College, which was located out by MacArthur Park now, similar about where the UALR Law School is located now. And Dr. Bentley actually taught or lectured at St. John's College on anatomy. And at one point, it was considered, St. John's was considered for the location of the medical school. St. John's had been founded in the 1850s as a Masonic institution. When Little Rock fell to the Union Army in 1862, I think it was, they took over St. John's and turned it into a military hospital. And of course, then all educational activities ceased at St. John's. After the war, St. John's really had a hard time bouncing back from that. And the men who were looking at creating a medical school looked at St. John's, but then decided that it was not, it did not have enough stability nor the foundation, educational foundation, to support a medical school. But Dr. Bentley did lecture some at St. John's before the creation of the medical school a year later in 1879. As I mentioned, Mrs. Bentley, she settled into Little Rock society pretty well. She became a member of the Columbian Commission in 1899 and 1900. And so for all intents and purposes, they were really accepted into Little Rock society. Now, in early 1879, you'll hear this familiar story, 8 physicians in Little Rock came together and decided they were going to create a medical school, found a medical school. And so they were looking all over the city, the state, to see where this medical school could be located. They believed, and the newspaper supported this idea, that the medical school should be located in Little Rock, since Little Rock was the biggest city. It was centrally located. It was the hub for all business and medical uh, facilities and doctors and things like that. So they really believed it should be in Little Rock. They did look at St. John's. They ultimately decided St. John's was not the right place for the medical school. So they ended up striking a deal with Arkansas Industrial University, now the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. And they came to an agreement with the Board of Trustees of U of A, or AIU at that time, that they could use the name, the university's name, as part of the name of the school, of the medical school, but it was not officially a part of the university. They were just allowed to use its name. So the 8 doctors, Edwin Bentley being one, Roscoe Jennings, Philo Hooper, John McAlmont, Augustus Brysocker, James Dibbrell, James Southall, and Claiborne Watkins, pulled their money together, and they purchased the Sperandeo Hotel in downtown Little Rock as the building for the first medical school. They bought it for $5,000. Each doctor invested $625 to purchase the building and set up the school. The school was proprietary, so any money that the school made from tuition or whatever profit the school made, it went back to those 8 founding physicians. It wouldn't be until 1911 when the medical school officially became a part of the University of Arkansas. But from 1879 up until 1911, it was Arkansas Industrial University / University of Arkansas Medical Department. All 8 physicians that helped found the school taught at the school. Dr. Bentley taught anatomy at the school, and he was very well regarded during at the school. When the school opened in September 1879, he gave a speech welcoming the students and talking about how great it was for the state for this medical school to have been founded, and what a great influence and impact it would have on Arkansas. And then at the end of the first semester, or the first academic year at the medical school, Dr. Bentley was chosen to give the commencement address, and the newspaper reported that he delivered the closing lecture on mental culture from a psychological standpoint. The lecture was a worthy crown for the series he has so faithfully delivered. And Dr. Bentley's closing words were touchingly beautiful. His words of encouragement and inspiration will long be remembered by the students and teachers, reported the Gazette in 1879. So he stays at the school, teaching at the school. He's also, remember, he's still employed by the U.S. Army as a surgeon at the arsenal. And he stays like that, or he stays in that position until 1880, 1886, I believe it was, maybe 84, I can't remember. But anyway, he's transferred out of Little Rock, and he's transferred to Fort Davis, Texas, in western Texas. But he only stays there a couple of years. By 1888, he is back, or 1886, excuse me. He's back And then he just sort of picks up where he left off. He um, is working at the U.S. Arsenal again in Little Rock. He begins teaching again at the medical school, and he just, becomes reintegrated into the society. He had only been gone a couple of years, so, and he is very well received on his way back to, or when he comes back to Little Rock. Now, in 1888, he finally retires from the military. He is uh, given this large party, this accolades on his career. Um, and so in 1888, he retires from the U.S. Army, but he does not, he continues his medical practice. He sets up his own private medical practice and he continues teaching at the school. So just, just regular life in Little Rock for him. Um, at that time, obviously, Little Rock had grown to a bigger city, not so much in the 2 years that he'd been gone, but since uh, the medical school had a big impact on Little Rock, and it was growing at a decent rate. So he continues at the medical school. He's a very popular teacher. Here's a photo of Dr. Bentley and Dr. Frank Wissenhaller doing one of their clinics where they're examining a child. This is from 1903. So this would have been so when he comes back in 1886, they would have still been in their original building, the Sparandio Hotel. In 1890, they moved to their second building just down the street at Second and Sherman Streets. And that is the building where Bentley would have spent most of his career. And there it is on your screen. In 1904, Bentley is elected dean or president of the faculty at the medical school, and he stays in that position as president of the faculty dean for a few years. Simultaneously, he's also continuing to practice, doing his private practice and teaching anatomy at the medical school. Their house, he and his wife lived on McAlmont Street, the 12th and McAlmont Street in downtown Little Rock. Their son Carl actually had a house right next to them on McAlmont as well. So it's interesting. So he continues, he's living in his house, he has his private practice, he's teaching at the medical school. He passes away in 1917, but interestingly enough, and this is sort of out of order, but the medical school later on, when it moved again, um, and for its fourth location, it actually bought the Bentley property at on McAlmont, and built the medical school. Now, but Carl Bentley, the son, his house was still there at the time. And so I just found that really ironic that the fourth location of the medical school would turn out to be the property of Dr. Bentley, one of the founders of the medical school. As I mentioned, Dr. Bentley dies in 1917 at the age of 92. He had suffered a fall at his home in the front yard. He hit his head, and he lingered for a few weeks until he finally passed away in February of 1917. His funeral was held in Little Rock, and then his body was shipped to Arlington, Virginia, where he was buried in the National Cemetery there. His wife continued to live in Little Rock in their house on McAlmont Street. She died in 1920, so not too long after he passed away did his wife pass away also. Now, their son, Carl, became a very prominent member of Little Rock Medical Society or Little Rock Medical Circles himself. He was very well known in Little Rock. He also taught at the medical school some at the same time as his father. Um, he was a faculty member in the Department of Surgery at the medical school from 1896 to 1918, and then again from 1922 to 1926. Um, and like I said, he also has had his own private practice, and he was very well known in Little Rock as well. So the Bentley family just had a really major impact on the medical scene in Little Rock. Without Dr. Bentley, with his moving to Little Rock in 1878 and helping bridge that gap between the two medical societies, bringing them together so they could form and found the medical school. I think it just really changed the trajectory of the medical history in Arkansas. So we have a lot to be thankful for in Dr. Bentley and what he did for the medical school and for the medical history in general in Arkansas. So I appreciate everyone being here today. Again, this presentation was recorded. If you'd like to watch it again, or you can forward it to someone else who wasn't able to make it today, it will go up on YouTube in a couple of weeks. There's the link to YouTube on your screen, but you can also just go to YouTube and type in SHMHP. And then you can locate all the videos that we put up there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to use the chat feature. I'm going to try to close this. No, Carl Bentley's house does not still stand. It was torn down at some point. I'm not sure exactly when it was torn down, but it was torn down. I'm imagining it was probably in the 1960s during the urban renewal, but I'm not positive on that. But more research needs to be done on Carl, on the younger Bentley, because he had a big impact on the state as well. Any other questions? Okay, well, I appreciate everyone being here today, and I hope you'll join me next month, June 5th, from noon until 1, and we'll talk about Dr. Claiborne Watkins and his contributions to the medical scene here in Little Rock. So thank you. Y'all be safe, and we'll see you next month.